There we go. Hi, everyone. This is Sierra from Hope Learning Youth Webinars. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's August webinar. We will be speaking all about seagrasses and living shorelines, which are so cool to learn about. And yeah, so if you're new to our webinar series, I'm the host, and we do these webinars almost every month with a different guest speaker and environmental organization in the community. We do them with Blue Green Connections, and all of our videos and webinars you will be able to see on our YouTube channel. So definitely go follow us and make sure to check out our future webinars for next month. So, without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Thomas Ries from the Ecosphere Restoration Institute. So, if you'd like to say hello.
Hello, Sierra, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be talking all about seagrasses. I love seagrasses and learning all about our ecosystems here in the Florida area. So yes. Now as more people are coming on, let's get into it. So my first question for you is how did you get started in the restoration work that you're doing now? How did you create these programs?
Well, we'll start back when I was in high school. I got aptitude tests, and they say I should be a physicist, and I'm like, I don't want to do that. I was watching Jacques Cousteau back in those days. Great
Yeah.
program, and I was smitten by that. And it was like, that's what I'm going to be, a marine biologist somehow. Went to college down here at the University of South Florida, got my degree in biology and geology. And, there wasn't a lot of jobs for this type of stuff back then. So you just worked in any way you could. But over the years, I was able to do some work like mapping the nation's wetlands under the National Wetland Inventory. And then eventually got really lucky to get a job with the Southwest Florida Water Management Program. They have a program called SWIM, Surface Water Improvement and Management, and our job was restore Tampa Bay and other water bodies, but Tampa Bay being the number one project.
Mm-hmm. And why did you want to go into this work? Like, what was the inspiration behind it? I know I've always loved like biology and nature, so it's exciting. But what about you?
And similar to you, I've always liked being outside and just being out in nature. It's just
Mm-hmm.
something about it. It's spiritual in some ways. And so if we can do something to preserve that habitat for future generations and protect that and then restore it, a lot of it needs to be restored, but one way or the other, protect it for the future generations. That's really what I'm trying to do. And Ecosphere Restoration Institute is a nonprofit that I started 20 years ago specifically to do more habitat restoration. And I'll tell you why. When I worked for the state, we did a lot of projects, great projects, but 100% of them had one common denominator. They were all done on public land with public
Mm-hmm.
dollars, which makes sense. But if you look at the map, most places, especially in this area, only 22% is owned by the public. The other almost 80% is private. So even if we restored all the 27%, we're not moving the needle. We need to be working on private lands, and that was kind of hard to do. No public agency was willing to do that. So our nonprofit, we specialize in what we call P3s, public-private partnerships. So we'll go on private property that's degraded and get public dollars to restore it if they put conservation easements on it to protect it. So that gets us to do projects where they're most important, not just because it's owned by the public, because the fish and birds don't care about who owns it, and we shouldn't when we decide where to do projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And when you were starting Ecosphere Restoration 20 years ago, was that a hard thing to get going? Were people interested in it? And what was that experience growing it up like?
It was pretty easy setting up the structure of the 5013C, the federal designation. And we just happened to have a really good potential client, a private developer, and they were willing to set aside some of their lands for us to restore if we could get all the funding, right? Otherwise they were going to just sell it and it was going to be a 7-Eleven and a tire store. And it was 26 acres down in Palmetto. And today it's Palmetto Estuary Preserve and it's won awards for its design. And so that really was what started it. A lot of these, it's hard to find projects where the private landowner is willing to put their land under conservation easement, but they do exist. We work a lot with Tampa Electric Company, private corporation, and they've been a really good partner with us. So it's been pretty easy, but not all projects I go after make it, right? It takes a lot of collaboration, and if somebody steps away, then the project fails.
Mm-hmm. How long do your restoration work? How long does it take, to
Yeah.
implement living shorelines?
Well, each project is different. Unfortunately, there's no one set answer. And so you have to
Mm-hmm.
go through a design process and then you have to get permits. Even though you're fixing the land, not destroying it, you still have to get permits as if you're developing the land. And so that can take 9 months. It shouldn't take that long, but it can take 9 months, sometimes a year, just to get the permit. So most of our projects we are usually in the ground in about 18 months, which is really fast because when I worked for the government, that usually was 3 to 4, sometimes 5 years, just because it's a slow process. But we have all our contractors are ready to go. And so as soon as we get permits, we jump on projects. So we are blessed in the fact that we can put projects in pretty quickly.
Okay, yeah. And so let's go back for a minute and explain for everyone who's not sure what a living shoreline is exactly. I know I've just started learning about it and attending Ecosphere's restoration efforts, but I had no idea what a living shoreline was at first, and like what do you even do to implement that? So can you talk about the basics of what that is?
Sure, and I have a PowerPoint. If you can switch to that screen, I will show you
Yes.
some of the projects and what a living shoreline really is. So you tell me when you're ready.
Yes, I think you are sharing the screen, and everybody can see your presentation.
Okay, so let's start out here. This is a natural shoreline here in this depiction, whether it's a lake or an estuary. There's upland, in this case on the left, and deep open water on the right. All the activity, the fish, the organisms, the frogs, anything that's living there is living between the upland and the open water. That's where all the productivity is. Unfortunately, in Florida or in a lot of places, when there's some erosion, back in the day, they would get an engineer involved and they would put a seawall in. So you'd have your
Mhm.
erosion, you got to do something here. In this case, there's a road, you don't want to lose that road. So this is what was put in, seawall. Now that's
Mhm.
good. It's hard and it shows you where your property ends. But the problem is, what do you have now? You have uplands and open water. Nothing in between. All where all the life is on a natural shoreline, that natural slope is gone, right? And
Mhm.
so that's a problem. Now, not to say that there isn't places for seawalls and hardened shorelines like this. If you're going to live on this kind of open water, you better have a seawall and you better be ready to leave when the storms come because you are sitting right at the high energy zone. So some places the seawalls make sense, but that seawall goes back in these coves where there's no energy and there shouldn't be a seawall here at all. And most of these seawalls only have a certain life. No matter how well you build them, if you don't control the water from the top, it can pop out the bottom. And if you have water go
Mhm.
over the top many times, then that's what happens. And so even if you build them right and you don't have water issues, they have finite lives, about 40 years, and they're very expensive to replace. And again, there's no ecosystem services at all with the wall. And so unfortunately, the United States has a lot of this up in the Northeast. Florida, Pinellas County, Brevard County, 75, 80% of all the shoreline is seawalled. So all that
Mhm.
habitat's gone immediately. And so we need to do something in front of the seawall. And in places like here in Florida, all this man-made land right here, and what you see here is 30 miles of seawall. right in this picture.
Mhm.
So you can tell it adds up quickly. And we've done a lot of projects, a lot of them in Hillsborough County per this map. And I can highlight one. This is Stewart Middle School on the Hillsborough River. That was almost 2,000 linear feet of shoreline. It was all covered with non-native trees, in this case,
Mhm.
lead trees. And there was a 4-foot escarpment or eroded shorelines. And the school couldn't see this, use this as a living lab for their students, nor see the river. So we ripped all that out and we put in this real basic design, some rock at the bottom that's 2 feet wide and 1 foot high, a little trough behind it on the landward side, and put plants in, and then nice gentle slope. So as sea level rise, the plants can actually move up the hill. They can't move up a vertical wall. So this is just some pictures of it going in. I won't spend a lot of time on here, but you can see, and this is what it looked like 3 months later. And this was a year later, and this is 9 years later. There is no erosion, and there's a lot of boat traffic through here. In fact, more than when we did this project. So this is what can be done. And I'll go a little bit further, working with Safety Harbor in the high energy area. There was a seawall here, it was dilapidated. The city was going to replace it. There's no grants for that, but we said, we'll get you funding if you put a living shoreline, even in this high energy location. So this is what it looked like we were done. We cut the seawall out and put in this. So a living shoreline is a nature-based approach using natural materials. So in this case, we're high energy. We have to have some rocks, but we have plants, and eventually mangroves grow there. And this is what it looks like. And about 6 months later, got hit by a Cat 2 hurricane. I was out there the very next day, and it was like this. Yeah, we need to do a little bit on the plants, but it totally held. The fence in that bottom picture would be taken out by waves, but that living shorelines did hold. So it's just showing you that there are options here to use nature-based solutions to stabilize your shoreline. And now they're coined living shorelines because they do two things. They provide the ecosystem services, and number two, you don't have to replace them. And one last thing is, over time, they get stronger, and it's just the way to go for doing this. And every one we've ever put in was cheaper than putting in a brand new seawall.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, that does seem like a more efficient way to handle the solution instead of replacing them. How long have the seawalls been like put along the shorelines? Has
Well, a
that
lot
been
of
a new
this,
thing?
well, not really. I think a lot of this was coming in starting in the 50s, and the most of it what came in the 70s. And you remember, these seawalls are lucky to live 40 years. So a lot of
Mhm.
them need to be replaced now. So this is the time to tell people that they have an option. If you buy a house on the water, never had a house before on the water, and you see that seawall is, who do you call? Well, you call the seawall people, and they go, sure, we'll put a new one in, right? They don't even
Mm,
know that there's an option. Now, in many
mm,
places, you will need to keep it, right? And then you can do stuff in front of your seawall if you can't take it out, like put rocks in it. And then we put embedded sediment in the rocks, and we plant plants in here. At Eulalie Restaurant in downtown Tampa, we did that in front of the seawall. And now the mangroves are 7 feet high, and people are worried about view shed. By the time they're 7 feet high, they're sticking above the wall a couple feet. So you still have a view shed. You can trim them, but you also have now life there. There was nothing there when I threw a cast nest. Now we catch fish and crabs and see all kinds of birds. And so it's a transformation that would really help Tampa Bay or any water body that has hardened surfaces.
mm. And what kind of plants do you use for your living shorelines? I know you also work with oysters. So can you talk about like what types exactly are you using for these projects?
Well, it depends where we are. Where we're in freshwater areas, we use freshwater emergent marsh grasses. In
Mm,
the estuarine areas, we'll use plants that can handle salt water. There's only 4 species that usually use, and they're all called cordgrass or spartina. And we put those in at different elevations to where they are used to. Some have to be in the intertidal zones, some have to be just above it. And so we
mm,
plant those in,
mhm,
and we let the mangroves or any fork big trees come in on their own. Let that happen naturally.
mhm.
And so that's what we usually plant in these areas to get them back.
Okay.
And then I will say, because you did mention oysters, oysters
Mm,
are a very important component. If you're in the right salinity zone, you can't be too salty and you can't be too fresh. But if you're in the right sweet spot for oysters, they are the
mhm,
best thing because they grow
mhm,
9 times faster than sea level rise. So your little structure you put out there will continue to grow. It's like having a growing seawall, and it provides a lot of filtration. Every single oyster filters 50 gallons of water each. And you have
mm,
thousands
wow,
of those. That really cleans up the water. And the cleaner the water, that means more light making to the bottom for seagrass.
mhm. And with the oysters filtering out the water, do they also filter out like microplastics in our waters?
Yeah, they do. I don't think they want to be doing that, but
Mm-hmm.
they will accumulate the microplastics in there. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
something you have to start thinking about when you're eating oysters, unfortunately. But yeah, they filter out anything they can get through their, through their filter system.
Okay. And then after you have implemented these living shorelines, do you know like what kinds of animals come to live there after that's been done? Like manatees, do they come? Or I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Eulalie Springs, which is downtown Tampa, was a spring that was two springs that flowed to the river back till 1920s or 30s. And then they piped that spring run to the river, and no one wasn't even in any books. Somebody told me it was there. I didn't believe them. I went and saw that spring. I'm like, what the heck? We're going to rip these pipes out and let it flow naturally. We did that project. Very expensive and small, but really incredible. And within a month of opening that up, we had 33 different species of fish. Interesting, we have largemouth bass swimming with snook, with blue crabs and shrimp because it gets both saltwater and freshwater mix, and 33 different species, 33 individuals, separate individuals of manatees frequent that in the summer. We could identify
Mhm.
them. And so, yeah, there's a lot of life that gets attracted as soon as you put this in. In fact, the day we opened that up, the manatees were swimming over the floating turbidity barriers to get in. They wanted to
Mm,
get in there, right? And so
yeah.
you don't have to put a signpost up. They know how to find these places.
Hmm. And so I know you do these projects in our area in the Tampa Bay. Do you also do them in other states or like down the coast of Florida? Oh, where do you do
Yes,
them?
we work all around Florida, mostly in
Okay.
Florida. Done some
Hmm.
stuff, worked on, helped others work on projects in Alabama along the coast and stuff, but mostly it's in Florida. There's a lot of shoreline to work on in Florida. That's more
Hmm.
than a lifetime of work for us right here. So we kind of focus here just because it's easier to, because it's a lot of work to go assess sites, and if they're
Hmm.
closer, in the state instead of going all over the place. I think we can do a lot in Florida. I'd have to have a couple lifetimes to go beyond Florida.
Hmm. Yeah. So how can someone, let's say you live on the water and you have a seawall, how do you implement a living shoreline? Do you have to take that out? Do you go through your organization? I don't know if someone was wondering how they can make their waterfront more eco-friendly, I suppose.
Well, that's a great question. Again, number one, most people don't even know they have an option. And so this is
Hmm.
important to get the word out like you are, and I appreciate that. Number
Hmm.
two, sadly, if you have a seawall and you want to replace it, you don't need a permit. It's exempt. But if you want to transform your seawall into a living shoreline, you need full permitting, local, state, federal. There we go. We're at
Wow.
six,
Mm,
9 months of permitting. Plus, it costs time and somebody to shepherd that through. So it's a major disincentive for people to do it. So we're trying to change that. Right now, we got funding from the Tampa Bay Escrow Program to design 3 properties next to each other in St. Pete Beach that have a seawall. We're going to put living seawall design in for them. But here's the good news is when we're done with this, we're going to hand that engineered, signed and sealed plans to all the residents around for free. Here you go. Here's
mhm,
your design. All you have to do is get the permits. And the permits could be done by a layman. But bottom line is the expensive part is the design. And so we're handing that design out, which costs about $40,000, and it's working with the city is paying half of this. So by giving that to people, that's a major, easier way for them to do it. And
Hmm.
if we can get the permitting to be streamlined, so converting a seawall to a living seawall or to a living shoreline is no permit required, then we
Hmm.
could really do something. And I'm trying to work with that. The local EPC is working with us. The federal government actually put a new provision in, but it's still a slow process. So we have a ways to go to make it easy.
Mm-hmm. And how many projects have you done personally throughout the state?
On living shorelines, I just was adding it up, 50 projects. Some of them aren't in the ground yet, but we're in the design phase. So 50 of those. I've done 130 habitat restoration projects, a lot of them when I work for the state or as a consultant to the state or through Ecosphere. So it's a lot of projects and they're all different. Some are like a quarter acre to a half acre like Eulalie, to rock ponds, which is 1,000 acres of new land forms on a 25-acre parcel. So they're all in between different sizes. But yeah, I've done a lot of those over the years.
Yeah, that's so cool. And then I know I have been a part, I think, of two projects of seagrass planting and helping with the oyster reef building. How can people watching be a part of that as well? Do you sign up on the website, and how do you do that?
Yeah, if you can contact us through Ecosphere Restoration institute.org, and you can get to that. And every year we do multiple shoreline cleanups or plantings. In fact, on September 9th, we're going to do a spring called Lowry Park Spring, which when I worked for the state back in 1990, we restored that spring, but it's been 32 years and the city doesn't really maintain it well. So we're going to go in there and spruce it up, remove some non-native plants, pick up some garbage, really get that spring back to where it was or should be. So yeah, go to our website and you can see some of our projects. You mentioned seagrass, and we do a fair amount of work, especially right now. We have funding from the state due to all the loss of seagrass, both coasts, on both this coast and especially on the East Coast, Indian River Lagoon has lost thousands, tens of thousands of acres. And that's the food for the manatee. And in fact, we have a major die-off of manatee due to lack of food for these manatees. So we have a project right now where we're planting 100 acres of seagrass. Now, that's a lot of acres to put in. And we are sitting at right around 15 or 16 already in the ground. And we got 85 plus to do, but
Mhm.
because we're still working on permits for those. But and that's just a drop in the bucket when you consider how much is lost, thousands of acres. But in these areas where there is no seagrass, putting some grass in to get it inoculated and started again is very important. So that's our biggest project we're doing to date, is to plant 100 acres statewide.
Wow. Yeah, and do you also grow your own seagrass plants?
Most of these plants, seagrass, we want to use native stock, and that side we want to take seagrass from the Keys and put it in a panhandle, for example. So what we do is we harvest through our contractor, which is Aquatech Eco Consultants. They have a farm, the largest actually aquaculture farm in the state. And so they harvest grasses, seagrass, and then they grow them in tanks, and then we transport them to the recipient site.
Okay. Wow. Um, and does the water temperature and does the depth matter for where you plant the different types of seagrasses?
Oh, definitely. We have to put them in the right depth, the right sediments. Um,
Mhm.
and we have to make sure the water quality is back, right? What made these seagrass go away, right? Usually it's
Mm,
an issue of water quality. If the water is still dirty, we can't put this in. And these 100 acres is not the way you fix an estuary, right? I'll give you a
mhm.
quick story. Tampa Bay in the 1950s had 38,000 acres of seagrass. By the 70s, it was down into the low 20,000s. That's all there was. And so the swim program and many other programs around the state did all kinds of work to try and improve water quality. And by the year 2014, we exceeded the amount of seagrass in Tampa Bay than we had in the 1950s. And then it went even higher to 40,000 acres. Unfortunately, the last 6 years, every 2 years we map, and look at those numbers, we've been declining. So Tampa Bay has lost 6,000 acres of seagrass in the last 6 years. So that's a backwards trend we do not want to do.
Mm,
So again, by planting these grasses where they once were and the water quality is good, is important. So all those parameters you said are super important. We want to give them the best chance to survive. So we put them in as shallow water as we can, where they get the
mm,
most light, the right sediments where they used to grow, and then hope for the best.
mm-hmm. And I know you talked about the water quality being a big issue for the seagrass decline, but what other issues and human impact is causing all the seagrasses to die out?
Well, it's not that easy. I wish it was a point source where there was some factory dumping dirty water where you can go work with them to shut that off or clean it up. It's
Mm-hmm.
all the runoff that comes off every time we have a rain. Every first quarter inch of rain,
Mm,
that first quarter inch is carrying all the runoff, which is oils, grass, grease, fertilizer from the roads and all into the bay because up to 1984, that's when the state put in rules that you had to clean up your water before it goes into the river or the bay. But everything was built before then. So unfortunately, all the runoff from the cities go right into the bay. So the swim program's done a lot of work trying to do these stormwater retrofit projects to clean it up and
mm-hmm.
more development. So it gets harder and harder. So if we're really at a tipping point where Tampa Bay, where we made all these improvements and now we're starting to decline, there's a lot more development going on. And so we really need to make sure our development projects are doing the best to not add more dirty water to the bay. And then when we have issues like red tide, that definitely kills seagrass. Now that's a natural thing that was here before any of us who are here, American Indians, that they saw red tide, but with all the nutrients that we produce in the current conditions, the red tides are stronger and last longer, and that can kill seagrass and of course a lot of fish.
Mm-hmm. And I do know that Pinellas County has a fertilizer ban in the summer months. So have you seen the impacts that has had? Um, does it like improve the seagrasses in those
We
months?
think so. It's hard to put a direct connect the dots because it's only been in place for so many years. But when that was enacted was when we were still increasing on grasses. And so I think
Mm,
it makes a huge difference because that fertilizer is very powerful. It has a lot of nitrogen in it. In Tampa Bay, if you put a teaspoon of nitrogen in, that's like adding fuel to the fire. Whatever's growing
mm,
in the water column, like chlorophyll A, these tiny microbes, they explode and then the light can't reach the bottom. And if that happens for more than 6 weeks, then the seagrass die. So I think it's super important. It's super effective. Unfortunately, the state is considering overriding these bans. And
I
that's
did hear
that's a
about
problem. That's a problem because people don't understand how important that is. And the more people that do not put fertilizer in the summer when we really don't need it, then the bay has a better chance of staying healthy.
that. So with also um, not using fertilizers, what other little things can people do to help our waters and our seagrasses thrive?
Well, I think you hit it on the head. If you can watch what you're putting in the water, that's grass clippings, fertilizers, keep stuff from going in the water, and things that you wouldn't think. I mean, it's easy to say, lower your carbon footprint, but really, if you put one less light on or turn your AC down 1 degree, that means that much less power is coming to your house, which means that much less natural gas or coal is being burned by a power plant to bring you energy. And it doesn't sound like much, but if 10% of all homes did it, we would see our footprint drop. And that means there's less air pollution because 60% of our nitrogen comes from atmospheric deposition directly on the bay or running off from the roads and streets to the bay. So if we can keep the carbon footprint down, and the fertilizer, it can make a huge difference. We're not changing our quality of life. It's just being cognizant of our carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm. And then what about, I've heard that storm drains play a big part in like transporting the runoff. Do you see that as well?
I do. And see, back in the old days, they would just have a grass ditch, and that would convey any runoff eventually to a pond or a lake or a river or the bay. But in modern times, I'm not trying to blame engineers, but the engineering solution was, oh, we can move the water faster. We don't want people
Mm,
flooding. So they put curb and gutter in. Well, the curb and gutter is impervious. So all that water it's running towards wherever it's going is not being absorbed in the ground. And so it
mm,
conveys it
mhm.
quickly and efficiently,
Yeah.
but that means there's no chance for it to abate some of the chemical load and the nutrients. So if we went back
Mhm,
to having natural grass flowways, the more nature-based solutions, by the time the water gets to the river or wherever it's going, most of all the nutrients have been absorbed by the ground and it's recharging the aquifer. So
mhm.
we over design things because we're trying to be really efficient. Well, we should be less efficient because
Yeah.
it's best for the environment and it really would help us. And so those drains work too well, I have to say, if you can. And I understand we don't want to flood, but I say that if your ground is absorbing the water, then that's okay if it takes a little longer to get there because there'll be less water going to the bay.
Mhm. And what has been your favorite aspect, you'd say, about this whole journey, I'd suppose, of you creating the projects and creating Ecosphere Restoration? What has been your favorite part?
I think it's, well, seeing a project go in. Okay, you can't, that is got to be the favorite part. But I think part of that it's the collaboration, pulling
Mhm,
different entities that usually don't even talk to each other, pull them together, pulling in funding from different parts, and setting this house of cards up. Um,
mhm,
when it stands, it's impressive. You can get some unbelievable projects in, and bringing volunteers out there and having people feel like they own it. Hey, I did that project. That
mhm,
all that to me is more important than putting the project in itself. Even I say that as important as I think it is put project in, having people involved from collaboration to the volunteers is very powerful. I think that really makes different people then feel like, hey, they're contributing and they want to do more, and that's all positive.
mhm. Yeah, I remember doing, I think it was a few weeks ago, one of your projects, and we were all passing down the buckets of oysters, and it was a lot of fun meeting different people who were interested and passionate about creating these living shorelines. So yeah, it is definitely a fun event, and you get to learn a lot by being a part of it. So I do recommend anyone watching to volunteer with Ecosphere Restoration. It's a lot of fun. Yes. So, we do have some questions in the chat. I always like to open it up to the audience, see what their questions are and what they're thinking about. So, if anyone has any questions, make sure to put them down below. Let's start with a few. All right. Um, okay. Our first one is, what do you do with the seawalls when they're removed? Do you ever use the concrete fragments along with rocks for shoreline stabilization, or is concrete bad for the ecosystem?
Hey, those are good questions from Tracy. And I will say that, what we do with these remove seawalls, we usually don't rip them out of the ground. We cut them at what we call the mud line. All right. Okay. You've got a seawall and you're going to make a nice gradual slope. And wherever that intersection is, we cut the seawall off. We cap what's left because it's a good solid base to put your baseline. That's where you can put your oyster bags and then put plants in.
Mm,
And yes, we do use that concrete as the bottom of building some maybe protection in front of it. There has to be no rebarb protruding out. That has to be cut off. The
mhm,
concrete is not the best thing to put in the bay, but this concrete's been sitting out there for 40, 50 years. So it's not as bad as brand new concrete, so to speak.
mm, mhm,
And so we will use it, and then we usually put limestone over top of it. And sometimes there's really soft sediments. And so if you just put limestone out there, it can sink in the mud, or your oysters could sink in the mud. So we'll put some of
mm,
this concrete fragments in, let that be sacrificial and go down and create a base. And then you put your preferred material, either limestone or oyster bags on top of it. So yes, we try and recycle it as much as possible.
mm, mhm. And our next one is, are there any negative side effects for animals?
Not that I know of. I will say that a vertical wall is not good for any animal to try and crawl up.
Hmm.
And so by putting a natural slope in there and put a living shoreline in, it's actually very beneficial for the animals, whether it's birds or, beavers or whatever it is is using that shoreline, otters. They can now use it where before really it's a desert until you take that wall out and soften the shoreline.
Hmm. And then let's see. Is there anything Blue Green Connections can do to help round up volunteers or spread the word?
Definitely. I appreciate you guys asking that because I have a network of volunteers, but it's only so big. For our next thing we're doing at Lowry Park Spring, we're looking for 70 volunteers. We're going to have this announced here on Eventbrite, and so we can have people sign up so we know we have enough people. But yeah, collaborating with you guys like this is really important for us because we only have such a small network, and sometimes we're in different parts of the county and stuff, and we may not have that many volunteers without your help.
Mhm. And also for anyone who doesn't know, Blue Green Connections brings you these webinars and they post all about it. So go follow them. Oh, they do a really fun festival in February. That's always a fun thing to do. And our next question, you touched on it a little bit, but where do you get your secret grasses?
Well, we definitely harvest our grass from the area that we're going to be planting into. So like when we're doing here, there are few places where the bottom is owned by private entities. And like I said, our contractor Aquatech has a harvesting license. So we'll pull grass from there. You pull out small little plugs amongst a meadow and it quickly heals. So we're very cautious in how we harvest. Everything's about a meter apart. Just take a small plug out, take it to the nursery, grow it, expand it, and then plant it. So we get local grasses to do any project wherever we are in the state.
Mm-hmm. And also, I'm curious, does boating like negatively affect seagrasses in our area?
Yeah, unfortunately, boats, especially props, if you go in too
Mm.
shallow water, the prop will literally cut a groove into the seagrass, and we call them prop scars. And some of them that get
Mhm.
so deep that it takes 5 years of never another boat going there for it to begin to heal.
Mhm.
And that's got only worse in the last 15 years with the advent of these shallow draft boats that can go really in shallow water, truly can move around in 12, 14 inches. But it's hard for the operator to tell whether you're in 14 inches or 8 inches. And so a lot of times unknowingly, boats are prop scoring. And so we have to be very careful. If you're hitting the bottom, stop, get out, push your boat out. Um,
Mhm.
there's thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of prop scars in Tampa Bay, and some of them are being repaired, and other ones they try and close off. People don't like areas being closed off, but like
Mhm.
Cockroach Bay, those portions should be closed off to give it a chance to heal, and then let boats back in. And you should just pull and troll, use trolling motors, right? Not high powered, gas powered engines.
Mhm.
So anyway, it is a problem.
Okay. And are they seagrasses? Are they generally slow growing or fast growing, or does it depend?
It all depends on amount of light, conditions, what time of year. I mean, in the summer we have 14 hours of sun, and in the winter we have 10, right? And so the days are
Mm-hmm.
shorter, they don't grow as fast. Seagrass is a very difficult plant to grow.
Mm.
My experience is that if you put it in and on the right conditions, within 1 month, you'll know what's living. Okay, it's not
Mm.
like other plants, emergent plants, you put them in and some make it, but over time they kind of come in. They either make it or they don't. There was a study
Mm.
on over 33 years looking at all the seagrass mitigation projects, and it was pretty low, 40% at best was the percent that made it. Now what we're seeing is closer to 60 to 70% because we have better techniques. But still, I've never done a project at 100%. Just the seagrass, man, it can be all the same depth, everything is the same, but there may be some high concentrations of sulfides in the soil in one spot and it won't grow there,
Mm.
right? or right
Mm,
below where you planted them is some bedrock. And so they can't grow, and there's no way to really know
mhm,
this. So we plant them. Like I said, we get a pretty good success rate on them, but you won't get 100%. That's why it's important to put it in many locations so that it can, where it likes it, it'll expand then. And that study showed that even though only 38 to 40% made it, after all those 30 years, it was like almost 80% of the portion that did survive were still there. So again, so you want to put out a lot of grass in a lot of locations, and where it works, it's going to stay.
mm. Okay, thank you. Now back to everyone's questions. How are construction projects monitored? How is it enforced that they use best practices?
You know, that's a really good question, because during construction, you're making the kitchen dirty. Okay. I mean, there's no question about it. You're mucking up the ground. There's no
Mm,
plants there if it
mhm,
rains. So you have to use BMP's best management practice, that's silt fence, floating turbidity barriers, and make sure the contractor is keeping them in place and in working order. So the, the water that gets all turbid while you're working is not polluting or clouding up the whole area, just where you're working. So we're very on top of our contractors to make sure they're adhering to that. And then if further, how are these projects monitored? Well, we'll go back to our project, every one of our projects, and assess them, because we want to learn, right? This is not
yeah.
like physics where you can land something on Mars and it actually works, because all
Mhm,
the parameters are totally known, right? There's no question what gravity is, and they know, and thrust, but with nature, it's a little bit, we don't know all the factors. And so you have to really make sure that you go back and look at these projects so you can fine tune your next design.
mm, mhm. All right, our next question, which goes in line with what we could do to help, is what temperature do you keep your house? Just looking for a frame of reference.
For me, I keep the house at 78. Um, and use fans. All our rooms have fans on, and that's comfortable. I just talking to neighbors and stuff, they usually are a couple degrees cooler than us, and yeah, that is comfortable. But if you can augment your 78 with fans, at least for me, I only can speak for myself, that is
Mhm,
comfortable. And every degree costs a lot more of your money to keep your house down. And again, if you could reduce your carbon footprint by doing stuff like that, or there's many things you can do, but I think if we can do that, that really helps the whole situation.
mhm. And let's see, for students looking into a career like yours, what kinds of degrees should they look into studying?
Yeah, well, and this is all hindsight for me. First of all, there was no really good classes back when I was taking it. It was more medical biology, but any ecology courses, botany courses. What I found, which I didn't realize at the time, was really important, is I took a lot of geology courses, because what we see when you go outside in a natural area is a total reflection of what's going on in the ground, right? What kind of soil is it? How wet is it? That decides which plants. It decides the entire ecosystem, is the geology below it. So I didn't think that was really beneficial for my career, but now
Mhm,
looking back, it's super beneficial, because now we look closely at what the subsurface conditions are before we plant areas or transform them back, because we've learned that just putting in, hey, this worked over here, it doesn't work here. Well, why? And we start realizing it was different geology below. And so geology, botany, ecology, um, I think, and there's a lot more schools that have those courses now. And so I think if you do that, you're going down the right track.
mhm. And do you think you necessarily need a college education to go in your field of work?
I don't think so. I think if you work with somebody, you don't have to have a degree. Unfortunately, if you want to get a job in this
Mm,
field by the state or even by a consultant, or most of the entities that would hire you as a biologist, they expect you to have a degree.
mm,
I would say,
mhm,
yeah, it's important to have, but I can tell you right now, I know a few people that did not get a degree, but they worked in this field their whole career, and they were really good at this. So
mm,
you can learn working with other professionals. but it's good to help to understand the basics. So even a community
Mm,
college degree in biology and ecology will get you a leg up as if better than you just coming from high school.
mm. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. How many cities along the shore help spread the word of or how, let's see, how can cities along the shore help spread the word of Living Shorelines installation?
Well, I think they could do a lot more than they do. Um,
Mm,
they own public property. There's grants out there. They will pay for these. So they should know that this is their chance to be the leader, right? To put in these demo projects. And so we've done a lot of demo projects. The one that you were talking about where you came out to help move oysters
mhm.
around,
Yeah.
Felipe Park, what we were doing was a true living shoreline on the south end. But on the whole east side, that's all seawall because this is a
Mm,
highly important archaeological tract of land. And so you can't take the seawall out. So we're
mhm,
doing 5 different treatments in front of a seawall. And so people can go out there that own waterfront property and see each one of these 5 treatments and go, hey, I like what I see here. This is not
mm.
experimental. These here, you can see it in action right now.
Yeah.
And so those are going to be going in next year. They have the funding for it. They just take about a year or so before it goes in the ground. We did a project down in Apollo Beach working on with Tico property at the Manatee Viewing Center where we did 5 treatments. I put a seawall in, 10 feet of
Mm,
seawall only for demo purposes. And right next to it, we have a living seawall. And then we have oyster domes and oyster bags and plants. So somebody can go out there again, kick the dirt, look at it firsthand and say, hey, I think that I'd like to have this. I think it's higher aesthetics and
mm,
nicer to look at and maybe even improve my property value. There was a project we did in Apollo Beach years ago, and we have the record of it where after doing the restoration site, people's property values went up by 10 to 11%. So
mm.
it's not just doing the right
No.
thing for the
Mhm.
environment. This is the right thing for your pocketbook if you could do that at your private property. But to go back to the questions, cities, counties, they need to put more in because people don't know about them, and then they're skeptical
Mhm.
about stuff that's new, right? You got to show it to
Yeah.
them working before people feel comfortable enough to step away from the hardened shoreline that they've seen all their lives.
Hmm. And would you say, like, you were talking about permits, is that the only obstacle um to implement as a living shoreline?
Well, permits is the hardest one because it takes so long. But
Yeah.
you got to have the right design, right? One size does not fit all. I can't say that enough. I mean, each site is slightly different than the other site. Although what I was telling you about the St. Pete Beach, we're going to make this design for 3 places and it's going to be transferable to 70 or 80 houses. Yeah,
Mhm.
that is all the same conditions, but I couldn't use that design 5 miles away because
Mm,
it's different depth, different sediment, different wave energy coming into that site. So it's important to know that it's the permitting is a big problem, and then you have to make sure you have the right design for the right location.
mm,
I'd like to just throw in is the city of Treasure Island. They have this big piece of property, has about 3,800 linear feet of seawall, and it's in bad shape. And of course, they wanted to do something. So we're able to take over 1,000 feet of that shoreline and make it a true living shoreline because it's facing an embayment and it's protected. And then as it
mhm,
goes around the bend, that side, the 2,000 other linear feet, is facing the inner coastal waterway where boats go. And so you can't take the seawall, but we are softening that seawall, making it a living seawall. And going to these places when they're done, which will be another year or so, I think I mean, people, they're going to put a kayak launch in. Today, if you
mm.
kayak launch, you see nothing but seawalls. But in the
Yeah.
future, you'll be able to see all this life, and fish and birds. And I mean, I think
Mm.
when people see the difference, they're going to be more inclined to consider doing this and pull the trigger on it.
Yeah, for sure. And all right, what is the date of your next event in Lowry Park Spring?
September 9th at 8 a.m.
Okay. And do you usually do these events all day long? or do you know how long it takes?
We don't want to burn people out. 2 hours in this temperature is enough. So we
Yeah.
start at 8 and try to be done by the latest 11, 10 to 11. I really, want to thank volunteers to give up their Saturday morning, to get up early, go out here in this heat and work. Is huge. And so last thing I want to do is burn anybody out. So we never stay out there
Mhm.
more than 2 to 3 hours. We try and get sponsors to provide t-shirts. We're going to provide free t-shirts at this, and maybe get somebody sponsor and give some food out afterwards, and of course water and all that stuff. We want to make it
Mhm.
so that people will like coming back.
Yeah. And with volunteering, is it easier to work in low tide or in high tide?
Great question. It depends what you're doing, but most of the time it's a lot easier to work in low tide. If we're
Mm,
planting marsh grasses, it's easier for them to put them in the ground and make sure they're nicely tight in the ground. If you're doing it underwater, if there's a little air pocket, these plants can pop out when the tide comes in. So we really try hard to work at low tide conditions, just whenever possible, just because we have better success rates.
mhm. Okay. Thank you, Anna, for that question. Next question is, what is the lead time for Ecosphere Restoration to implement new projects? How much time goes into the design process, permitting, approval, and etc. of a living shoreline? For example, if a city decides to implement a living shoreline, how soon after that do uh, let's see, how soon after they make that decision would the first plant be planted? A
That's a
long
great
one.
question, and there's a lot to answer in here. I'd say there's two answers to that. I'm going to give you the traditional answers. We're working with the city or working with the county. From the time it takes to start a project and put the first plant in, 3 years.
Mhm.
It's just that's pushing it.
Yeah.
It just because they have bureaucracy and they have to go through all this processes to hire contractors. Now, if that same project, if we're taking the lead, we're getting them in 18 months.
Mm.
Not that we're that much better, but we're just mean and lean. I don't have this massive process to hire contractors. I have a stable of contractors right now, all ready to go. And all we do is say, hey, can you do this project? And they just say, oh, yeah, we're light on work. We'll be here. When do we start? And so we can move quicker. So when the government's involved, it's just reality. I'm not saying it's bad. They do great projects. They just are slower.
Mm. Okay. Well, it has been great talking with you. You're almost out of time. Is there anything else you'd like to add or mention before we end our webinar?
Um, I think you covered it really well. I really don't have much to add. I feel like I'm talking too much, but at the same time, if you don't host these things, then people wouldn't know about them. So I thank you. I really do. We couldn't. This is how the word gets put out, and we'll get more volunteers and more people behind this, and that's what it takes. No one person can do it. This needs to be done with the whole community.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate you taking the time. Sure you're very busy to speak with all of us. And thank you everyone who logged on. I appreciate your all support and willing to learn. And we will be posting this webinar recording to our YouTube channel if you want to rewatch some parts. But yes, thank you everyone so much. I encourage you to volunteer with Ecosphere Restoration and support everything they do because it's important. And yes, so thank you everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. And yeah, be sure to be mindful about our seagrasses and our living shorelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Sierra.